From the Flying Tigers, who took the very early P-40Bs into combat, to the later P-40Ds down to the P-40N. The RAF, of course, putting that classic shark's tooth on there that is forever resonant of the fierceness of the P-40. And by crikey, on the wrong end of that shark tooth, you knew the P-40 was fierce. The P-40 also flew in unfamiliar hands, the Japanese examples, because like their opponents, the British, the Americans, or their allies, the Germans, Italians, any fighting power would get its hands on an aircraft used by their adversaries. Interestingly, the American pilots that flew the P-40 with the AVG were given $500 for every victory that they achieved. And Charles Bond, with the number he achieved, actually bought his parents a house.
In the centuries since powered flight began, thousands of models of aircraft have come and gone. All but a handful of historic planes have been consigned to the scrap heap or the museum gallery. But there exists a core of devoted enthusiasts keeping the world's greatest aircraft operational and often still flying. These are the stories of those machines and those people making history come alive. Each one a plane resurrection.
The P-40 is probably the most recognizable warbird if it's done up in the classic sense. Everybody knows who the Flying Tigers are. I would make the argument that 99% of the people in the world only know the P-40 because of the Flying Tigers. And it's not to take away from everyone else who flew the airplane, because you know the British used it, the Canadians, everyone. I mean, it was a wonderful fighting machine for what it was. But the iconic teeth on it, the tiger shark mouth, is what makes it recognizable. Every kid loves the P-40. It was one of my first favorite airplanes because I saw one fly over town and you could see the teeth, you know, because he was coming to land. And every kid that runs up, they see the teeth and they love it. And kind of like the Corsair with the Disney movie with planes or whatever it was. Now kids know the Corsair, but kids previous to that movie, they all know the P-40 because of the teeth.
The P-40 really gained a reputation that in history to some extent has been lost. It's regarded by many today as a somewhat lackluster aircraft, and that's not fair. It's not fair on the Curtiss product. It suited combat in those theatres where aerial dogfights tended to take place at lower altitude. It has to be admitted that the P-40 was not good in combat above 20,000 feet. In Europe, Mustangs, Spitfires, 109s, 190s, their dogfighting would be anything from 30,000 feet down to the treetops. But in the Far East and in the desert theatre and on the Russian front where the P-40 served, then the combats tended to be under 20,000 feet, and that's where the Curtiss P-40 in its various guises proved to be an excellent aircraft. And some pilots, later given Mustangs, said that they thought the P-40 was actually the better aeroplane for that type of combat.
The P-40, a simple and, at the time, powerful, heavily armed fighter, found itself as very much the Cinderella of the pre-war fighter types used by the Allies. The Hurricane, and particularly the Spitfire, boasted the superior Merlin V12 engines, and the Spitfire notably adapted to major upgrades through its model life. But but the P-40 changed little and was surpassed by newer models. However, it was with this model that America, yet to be involved in the European War, set out to assist the Chinese against the expansion of the Japanese Empire with what we'd call nowadays a Black Ops mission. Notionally, private pilots were recruited to fly in combat with the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, in Chinese-marked P-40s against the superior numbers and superior equipment of the Japanese Air Force.
Flying Tigers, the famous American volunteer group, wing their way across China for the last time as volunteers. For 8 months, these Chinese signs have been the only insignia of the most spectacular and efficient fighting force in aviation history.
You know, the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, that's obviously what people think of whenever they think of the P-40. And those guys, what they did with the P-40 was nothing short of spectacular. But that's kind of kept the legend of the airplane alive, because it was far outclassed by later, and by the time it came out, by the time we got involved in the war, the airplane was outclassed by a lot of other airplanes. But you talk to people who fly it today, and I've been fortunate to fly one from the back seat, and everyone who's ever flown one loves it. I know a lot of people who would rather fly this than the Mustang, and I always hear that, unless it's a Bearcat. Everybody would rather fly a Bearcat than anything. But I've never met anyone who ever flew the P-40 that ever had anything bad to say about it. They always thought it was just the sweetest handling airplane, and they're extremely light on the ailerons. That I do know from personal experience. But it's just a wonderful little airplane. It's probably far more capable than history gave it credit for. The Cavanaugh Museum acquired it from a man named Joe Mabey out in Midland, Texas, back in the early 90s, I guess it was. I can't remember the exact year. And Mr. Mabey had it for about 15 years at that point. In 1977, this airplane went to the Reese Air Force Base Air Show up in Lubbock, Texas. Reese is now closed, but they used to have a great air show there every September, I believe it was. And 1977, I was 4 years old when we went to the Reese Air Show, and I have a picture of me and my brother and my sister standing right in front of the left wing on the airplane, and what's got our picture made there, and then I remember the guy that was all roped off, and I remember the guy saying to my mom, "Well, you want to take their picture?" And Mom's like, "Yeah," and he goes, "Well, y'all come on over here," and he put us over in front of the wing and took our pictures and all that. And what's really interesting about that is about the same time at the tail of the airplane, a guy, Chuck Gardner, who's one of our museum pilots here, Chuck and his sister were standing by the tail, getting nearly the same picture made by the tail of this airplane, not knowing that 30 some odd years later, Chuck would be flying the very same airplane and I'd be working on it. So it's strange how, just like with Fifi, everything in this business runs in a circle, and my life seems to have ran in a circle with warbirds. And so here I am. I get to work on an airplane that I first saw when I was 4 years old.
It was actually a trainer. It never went overseas or anything. It was in Colorado. You used it training towards the end of the war. And it went through a couple of different owners, and we picked it up along with the Wildcat at the same time, about close to 20 years ago, I guess.
The P-40 at Cavanaugh is immaculate in the markings of the aircraft flown by Charles Bond of the AVG. It follows the scheme very authentically, with one amazing exception. It carries the signature of the pilot who flew that aircraft in those distant days battling the Japanese before America entered the war. The AVG, the Flying Tigers they were called, a bunch of raucous, ill-disciplined, sometimes boozy volunteers who went, like many Americans before America entered the war officially, to fight with the Allied forces. And while they may have been difficult to control and discipline on the ground by their volunteer superiors, Chennault particularly as the leader, they fought tenaciously, and their kill ratio was amazing. They took the P-40B into combat. They struggled desperately to get spare parts, to get tires, to get components for the radio. And all this time, the Japanese advance was rolling through the Pacific theater of operations. And this handful of American pilots, with the Allies, with the Dutch, with the British, struggled against the might of Imperial Nippon. But the Flying Tigers gained a tremendous reputation in those days. Moreover though, they used the P-40 to advantage. They realized, as many later American pilots would realize, that the P-40, flown well, could take on anything the Japanese had to offer, providing you remembered to use the P-40 to its advantages and not try and take on a Zero to the advantages of the Japanese fighter. It wouldn't work.
One of the Army's deadliest fighter planes, the Curtiss P-40, loads up for a ground firing test. When the pilot presses the trigger, 6 machine guns bark as one. 2 50 caliber guns in the nose, shooting right between the whirling propeller blades. Every burst converges on the mark. The last word in synchronized firing.
The P-40 was, by the standards of the 1930s, sleek as a monoplane and heavily armed, with 6.3 or 303 guns, 2 in each wing and a pair embedded in the fuselage, firing through the propeller via an interrupter gear. As the type moved on, the through-the-prop weapons were quickly discarded, and the standard became the 2 50 caliber guns in each wing. The 1942 E model had a modest increase in engine power and restored its 6-shooter configuration with an extra 50 caliber in each wing. Ironically, in an effort to shave weight off the type late in the war, alongside aerodynamic modifications, the extra wing gun was once again dropped, much to the consternation of Allied pilots. The P-40 in its ground attack role could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs in total, typically made up of a combination of 250, 500 and 1,000 pound types, one beneath the fuselage and one beneath each wing. To understand this simple fighter fully, as it vastly outlived its theoretical life, we have to understand its rather difficult birth. Curtiss produced the P-36, its first modern fighter, in 1935. A new aerodynamic, all-metal monoplane, it featured a powerful radial engine and found some success with Allied forces, with just over 1,000 built and sold. It was, though, outclassed by the Me-109 and Hawker Hurricane, and despite efforts to modify its streamlining, it became clear that the best fix was to redesign the type with an inline power plant. First, they tried a V-12, with the radical concept of moving the cockpit to the rear of the fuselage. Pilots disliked the whole thing, and so a further version reverted to the regular cockpit position. That became the XP-40 prototype, which flew in 1938. Its performance was far inferior to what the designers expected, and it wasn't until a series of modifications to its radiator and cooling system, which finally gave rise to the P-40's distinctive chin radiator, that the Kitty Hawk, as the Allies named it, finally fulfilled its drawing board promise. The tough reality, though, was that the aircraft had, in effect, ended its development curve way before its contemporaries. Further modifications centered on cutting down the rear fuselage, much like the late P-51D Mustangs, and a range of tweaks in the never-ending quest for less drag to create a slippery and faster aircraft. The F variant, the first to carry the name Warhawk, even acquired, much like the Mustang, a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, greatly enhancing its high-altitude performance, but shortages of the type meant this modification was short-lived. The final effort to drag every moment of life and every hint of performance from the P-40 airframe was, perhaps, a radical step too far. Just a single photograph survives of a twin Merlin engine P-40. Whether the aircraft ever flew, or whether it's simply an engineering mock-up, we shall never know. In the days before fully immersive simulators, or even 2-seat training variants of most fighters, learning to fly a new aircraft like the P-40 was down to reading the manual and watching a helpful training film.
Engine torque pulls the left wing down, so keep the wings level by holding the stick to the right. Fly the plane off the ground by lowering the tail just a little at the takeoff.
Then you don't take off in a three-point attitude.
No, because that might put the airplane in a stalled condition, which would be bad at your slow speed right after takeoff. You see, engine failure or a gust of wind, when you are stalled so close to the ground, could be disastrous. Just as soon as you clear the field, retract the landing gear and retard the throttle and propeller control to normal flying power.
The quaint nature of the USAAF training film masks a cruel reality. In the early days of the P-40, trainees were more likely to perish in pilot-induced takeoff and landing accidents than through mechanical failure of the aircraft itself.
Pick up speed as soon as possible and climb at 140 miles an hour. Gain altitude fast. You can climb at full military power for 15 minutes with the Rolls-Royce and 5 minutes with the Allison. These settings are marked with yellow lines on the instruments. The P-40 is normal in all flight characteristics, as you will see when Lloyd goes through his maneuvers.
The P-40 was the unfortunate loser in a tug of love for the power plant that could have changed its fate. As we've heard, the British suggested a late model version powered by the legendary Merlin, albeit built by Packard, which could have transformed its high-altitude performance. However, the huge demand for the Merlin in its established fitments to Hurricanes, Spitfires, Lancasters and Mustangs, amongst others, meant that just a handful of Packard-powered production versions made it to the front line, the remainder reverting to an improved version of the Allison.
The making of Allison liquid-cooled motors is one of the most important tasks of the day, and one of the most intricate. Its mass production for national defense at this Indianapolis plant, also most complicated production. The assembly department, and here we witness the vital process of testing a motor. That thing of giant horsepower must be perfect. In a speeding plane, it must give unfailing performance. Soon we'll see a tryout with propeller, a whirl and a whir. The test is more exacting than flying performance in a plane.
The majority of P-40 variants flying today are powered by the reliable and abundant Allison V1710. The Allison V12 was a great engine in its own right and powered everything from an experimental B-17 Flying Fortress, airships, Mustangs, and the Bell Aircraft Cobra series. However, its initial lack of a high-altitude supercharger meant its host airframes were limited to low-level operation, at which, as we can see on this P-40 photo shoot with renowned photographer Mike Killian, it's in its element. While this example wears the familiar mid-war stars and bars of the United States Army Air Force, the P-40s deployed in China looked altogether different.
We're looking at the markings, of course, of the nationalist Chinese underneath the wing. The guns, 3 50 caliber machine guns there, various armaments, and then around to perhaps something that's famous for the P-40, the shark's mouth. I mean, how fearsome is that? It was used by the AVG, who actually borrowed it from the RAF, whose P-40s had carried those markings in the Desert Air Force. And it seems that they'd actually borrowed it from the Germans. You can take the P-40 and just follow that little bit of lineage back. The P-40 became a plane that had a tremendous reputation. It could dogfight, providing you use your aircraft to its strengths. In your P-40, attacking a zero would come in, use altitude, boom, zoom away, because this plane could fight if it kept speed. You didn't try and dogfight a zero at lower altitude, slower speed. You wouldn't win. Similarly, with the British in the Desert Air Force, the Australians, the New Zealanders, those that flew P-40s, many pilots came to love this aircraft. They felt secure it could take tremendous punishment and still get you home safely. All pilots throughout the Second World War would learn the advantages of their aircraft and the disadvantages of their enemy aircraft. The P-40 flew in unfamiliar hands, the Japanese examples, because like their opponents, the British, the Americans, or their allies, the Germans, Italians, any fighting power would get its hands on an aircraft used by their adversaries. Why would they want to do it? Well, there are stories abounding that say, well, they were flown on surreptitious missions in false markings, etc. These may or may not be true in some examples. The risks there are evident, because if you are a Japanese pilot flying a P-40, the chances are you'll be shot down by one of your comrades. More often than not, the aircraft like the P-40 would be taken to be evaluated, because you needed to know, when fighting a P-40, what were its weaknesses, what were its strengths. And the Japanese, like the British, like the Germans, like the Americans, would analyse enemy aircraft to get exactly those weak points and advise their pilots accordingly. So to see a P-40 in Japanese markings is fascinating, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they flew them in great numbers in combat. They were simply evaluation captured examples.
Charles Bond was born in Dallas, Texas at the height of the First World War. When he graduated from high school, he secured a place at the West Point Academy, but wasn't selected as an officer and returned to work for his father's painting business. In due course, though, he applied for and was accepted into a special fast-track scheme for Army pilot training and duly qualified in 1939. When the American Volunteer Group was founded in 1941, he was amongst the first to join.
Charlie Bond was a member of the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers, and Charlie was one of the pilots of that group, and he lived in Dallas. He was a Dallas native, and I believe he lived here until he passed away a few years ago. He was a good friend of the museum and participated in a lot of things we did. And so the airplane, it had been in its origin, and the paint that it was in when it was acquired, it had been in those colors for probably close to 30 years or something like that, 20 years, I don't know. And they overhauled this airplane, did a kind of a restoration on it, not a complete stock restoration, but a lot of in-depth maintenance. When they did, they wanted to do something to commemorate a local person. And who better to commemorate than Charlie Bond, who was with the Flying Tigers and was a local guy as well. And until Charlie's death, he would come out and answer questions about the P-40 and talk to people about it. And he had a lot of great things to say about the airplane. One of the first times that I remember coming here, just as a visitor, but long before I started working here, Charlie was here. They were having a big day where they had a bunch of guys signing autographs, actual combat pilots and stuff, and Charlie was sitting here in front of the P-40 talking about it. And I've got his autograph at home on one of the programs from that day, him and a guy who flew the Swordfish and a bunch of other really neat guys. But Charlie was a big fan of the P-40 and was a good friend of the museum.
Interestingly, the American pilots that flew the P-40 with the AVG were given $500 for every victory that they achieved. And Charles Bond, with the number he achieved, actually bought his parents a house.
In the Second World War, the true benefits of advanced camouflage on aircraft were only just becoming apparent, and it would be 50 years before the majority of combat aircraft adopted the now familiar air superiority grey. These were the days of personalization and a little bit of dark battlefield humor. The Flying Tigers adopted a distinctive logo on their aircraft, but the design came from the most unlikely source. The insignia was created for the civilian squadron by none other than Walt Disney cartoonists. Charles Bond, like all fighter pilots, also had reason to add his own graphics.
On the aircraft, just under the cockpit, you will see a total of 9.5 kill symbols that he achieved when flying with the AVG, the American Volunteer Group. Why half? Well, because he shared a victory with another pilot. So half a victory awarded to him. And what were the Americans doing in the AVG? They were actually in China. Bond came from Texas, and so did his boss, Claire Chennault. Chennault, in fact, the museum is on Claire Chennault Drive in Addison, in Texas. And you will notice that the markings on this particular aircraft, it's not American markings, they are China markings, Chinese for the AVG. This was before the advent of communism, and the Americans were fighting with Chiang Kai-shek. And we have to remember as well, in the conflict that erupted into World War II, as far as the British were concerned in 1939, as far as the Americans were concerned in 1941, but for the Chinese, they had been fighting since the early 30s against the Japanese, who had invaded China. And the AVG were young men who went to try and do their best because they could see the wrong that was being done. And when we think now of China involved in the Second World War, they suffered some 14 million casualties.
The AVG were, in theory, an all-civilian group, mere volunteers, not an official US force of any kind, and indeed their existence was disavowed by the White House itself. Each of the pilots and indeed the ground crews resigned their place in the US Armed Forces with the tacit approval of their superiors and simply joined this civilian company contracting pilots in China. They were, in essence, bounty hunters for the brief 7 months in which they roamed the skies looking for Japanese aircraft and defending the supply lines for the Chinese incumbents. This period is often referred to as the USA's undefeated season of aerial combat. However, 22 AVG pilots perished either in combat, training, or as the result of enemy bombing.
The AVG suffered losses. Charles Bond himself was shot down twice. On the first occasion, he bailed out, his clothing on fire. He landed, ironically, in a cemetery with his eyebrows gone. 2 bullets had creased his scalp, so close had they come to killing him. His scarf was on fire, his flying overalls were aflame, and he raced, as you would, to a nearby stream and rolled in the stream to try at least douse the flames before medical aid came along. He was out of action for a number of weeks, but was soon back in the fray.
When the AVG retired from action, its pilots didn't have a simple transition to military flying with the regular Air Force. They were, of course, civilians, and making the switch didn't prove straightforward.
His later career, he struggled to get into the US Army Air Force officially. When the American volunteer group was absorbed, they were not necessarily entirely welcome. They didn't like the official discipline sometimes imposed by the US Army Air Force, and some of them didn't settle, others did. Charles Bond eventually went on to have a successful career in the US Air Force, and the Cavanaugh Museum, because he was a Texan living locally, felt what better tribute to this pilot than to have their aircraft in his markings with his signature on the fuselage.
One of the neat things about it for us was Charlie Bond was one of the Flying Tigers, and he was a Dallas native and a very good friend of the museums, and so we painted it in his markings, and luckily he had a camera over there in China, so we had pictures of it from different angles so we could duplicate a lot of the original markings. And he was also one of the first ones to put the tiger shark teeth on it, and when we repainted it, we actually had him do one of the teeth with a brush, so it's pretty neat.
Throughout its career, the P-40 and all its variants seemed magnetically drawn to warm climates and adverse ground conditions. After the rough and ready airfields of China, with sparse maintenance and grueling missions, the Allies pressed the type into action in the scorching plains of North Africa.
Over the hot sands in the desert campaign, the P-40 also proved to be an excellent aircraft in the hands of the Royal Air Force and the South African Air Force. It was taken into fighting the German Me-109. It proved to be capable of handling the 109 because at the altitudes of the Desert War, generally 15 to 20,000 feet and lower, it hit the zone where the P-40 proved to be an excellent, tough, rugged aircraft, capable, given the skill of the pilots, of dealing with the Italian C-202, for example, one of the top Italian fighters, and the Bf-109. The P-40 could deal with it. A superb aeroplane.
The simplicity of the type proved an advantage in the desert, as field modifications that later became standard parts were made to filter the dusty desert air and protect the airframe, and indeed the pilots, against the adverse conditions. Sand penetrated every inch of the airframe, but taught the ground crews lessons in protection that are still in place today.
In the isolationist America pre-war, there were those that did not want to get involved in any European war. The Japanese drew them in by the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the fighter that was at Pearl Harbor and did valiantly but completely under-resourced was the P-40. But the Curtiss product then carried through the Pacific theater. But it had been there before America, before Pearl Harbor, with the American Volunteer Group. Because in America of the late 1930s, there were many young men, pilots, with a sense of adventure and, truthfully, in many cases, of course, the desire for money.
Despite the epic depictions in movies, the P-40s at Pearl Harbor sadly were unable to have any significant influence on the outcome of that attack. George Welch and Kenneth Taylor had been dancing and partying at the officers' mess until 6:30 a.m. At 07:55, they were rudely roused from their beds by the Japanese attack. Still wearing their tuxedos from the previous evening, they scrambled into their brace of Warhawks, 2 of just 18 operational examples on the base. They heroically took to the air and downed a handful of Japanese aircraft, returning to their airfield, refueling and rearming even while under fire. The P-40s and their pilots performed miracles that day, but could do nothing to avert the terrible consequences of the surprise attack. To add insult to injury, returning from their sorties, they were admonished by a senior officer, unaware of their involvement, for not wearing regulation trousers. With America pulled fully into the war, manpower for training and ferrying aircraft was short, and the United States government established the WASP, Women's Air Service Pilots, inspired by the British Women's Air Auxiliary. Unlike their British counterparts, the WASPs weren't delivering to frontline airfields and were not subject to the risk of being bounced by a roving enemy plane. However, the service was not without its risks. Nonetheless, many American women immediately answered the call.
At Avenger Field, Sweetwater, Texas, the Army Air Force is today training women pilots for many non-combatant duties. Officially, both during and after training, the pilots are known as the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and by the phonetic name, WASPs. Pifanella is the insignia of the WASP in training at Sweetwater. Designed by Walt Disney, the little winged lady is supposed to ride around with the students and help them out of tight spots. There's room for 500 girls at the school, and it's kept operating at capacity. 400 have already been graduated.
Thousands of women could fly, and they were employed to save manpower, to fly thousands of aeroplanes from production units or between air bases. And you would imagine, well, I would imagine, you know, this wonderful aeroplane sweeping in. Somebody's managed to get control of this P-40. And I would always imagine, you know, get out of the cockpit, lovely lady, gorgeous, maybe long blonde hair in the typical 1940s fashion. And I perhaps naively think, oh dear, you'll go a bit weak at the knees. But no, there was a little bit of concern. Some of the men didn't actually like the fact that these women were able to handle the aeroplanes just as well as they were. So it wasn't always met in a way perhaps we would think it would be today. So one of these actual wasps was a lady called Suzanne Parrish. She started to fly at the age of 19, and by the age of 21 she was a wasp. She actually flew P-40s, and she was so enamoured by the P-40 that she actually bought her own in 1971, and you can see it in the Air Zoo Museum in Michigan, which she founded.
Parrish campaigned her pink P-40 on the airshow circuit for many years, and despite the common perception that she'd painted the aircraft as a nod to her femininity, that wasn't the case. The scheme is part of a widely adopted Pink Panther look that in fact proved ideal at sunrise and dusk in the desert. In fact, the same concept remained in use right up to the recent Gulf Wars. Suzanne Parrish passed away in 2010, aged 87, but her aircraft hangs in the entrance of the Kalamazoo Aviation History Museum, known as the Air Zoo, immortalizing her relationship with the Warhawk. She will be forever remembered not only for her great airshow displays, but also for the cheeky, distinctive soundtrack played as she returned to the field. Ironically, perhaps, the most famous of the P-40s has also become the most infamous example. On June the 28th, 1942, Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping of the RAF was flying a P-40 Kitty Hawk between two British airfields in Egypt. It had been lightly damaged and was to undergo repairs and maintenance. Sadly, the aircraft and its pilot didn't arrive at their destination, and it was, like so many incidents of the type, simply written off as the attrition of war. In fact, it appears Copping had made a successful belly landing in the desert and survived his encounter, only, it seems, to perish in the elements, although his body has never been found. His aircraft, though, did reappear, discovered by an oil worker near Al-Wadi al-Jadidi, 200 miles from the nearest town, in the inaccessible wastes of the Sahara, beautifully preserved, exactly where it had stopped 70 years previously. A debate then raged as to what should happen to the wreckage, with its likely and most appropriate home a display in the UK, depicting it as it was found to honour all those airmen who lost their lives in North Africa. Sadly, that wasn't to be. The local government, keen to avoid the historic aircraft being plundered by treasure seekers, wisely moved it to storage, and there the story seemed to end. That was until 2019, when, to the great horror of many historians, the aircraft reappeared at the El Alamein Museum in a well-meant but misguided post-restoration condition. One dubbed its lurid and highly inaccurate paint scheme as an insult to the brave men who flew them, and another describing it as a lurid airfix kit bodge. Thus, it sits at the museum in a valiant effort to honour Copping and his colleagues, but also as a vivid example that not every plane resurrection turns out for the best.
They built over 13,000 Curtiss P-40s, and this is in military markings, but actually it's not a military aircraft any longer. It's got a civilian registration, appropriately NL40, because it's a P-40, N because it's an N model of the P-40. So somebody has very cleverly put the registration to relate to the aircraft.
I think everybody that flies it, it's one of their favorites. It's just a really, really neat airplane.
I've never heard anyone say anything bad about the P-40 other than it was expensive to fly. They didn't want to pay for the gas, but I've never met a person who didn't love flying the P-40.
One of the neat things we talked about was this being Charlie Bond's airplane, or in his markings. And he also came up with the concept of the first pursuit. It's Eve chasing Adam around an apple. Originally they had a red apple. They were worried that somebody might think that was the Japanese meatball. If you notice, one of the differences that we got from his photos he had was he had a different crew chief. So the normal paint scheme, this tan goes all the way up and meets the tan there. But they'd come through and painted green over there to paint over the other crew chief and repaint his new crew chief on there. So that's why there's green through there. That's not part of the original deal, but we were able to get that from the photographs he had.
Maintenance on the P-40, the only other thing other than the brakes having to be adjusted fairly constantly, the exhaust stacks will crack, and they'll do that in any inline, but the P-40 for whatever reason seems to do it a lot. And so we keep 2 of each welded up and repaired, and in fact, there's 1 of each in the airplane now, and then another 1 of each in the storage room. So if it's on the road somewhere, we can FedEx one to them, because it's not uncommon for them to crack and fall off. This way, go around and tap it and listen for it. And if you get one that sounds with a dull thud,
like a cymbal, the zzz kind of sound. Then on the Allison engine, we were talking about it being like a sawing machine. About the only Achilles heel with it is its magneto. It's got a dual mag, and it's got kind of a fibrous type drive on it, and that's something that you always got to check, because make sure it doesn't have any cracks or anything, because when it fails, the engine quits because both mags are off of one drive.
P-40 is a simple airplane. It's a 1930s design. I mean, if you look at a real stock P-40, it looks like it has water faucets in the wings for turning your hydraulics on and off. I mean, it's that simple of an airplane. The Allison engine is a sewing machine. If you take care of it, they just chatter right along. The brakes are the most difficult thing to keep in check. They're not hard to work on. They weren't good from the beginning. From the factory, they weren't good. And so a lot of people will start to think, well, these brakes should be better than they are. And we've got ours dialed in really nice, but they're not disc brakes. They're not going to stop like a Gulfstream jet, and some people think they will. But now, from a maintenance perspective, it's a sweetheart of an airplane. You just have to stay ahead of it.
Once their ground training was almost complete and young pilots had sufficient time on a trainer such as the T6, there was a final chance to check and learn about the one element that couldn't easily be tested.
You see, Lieutenant, with a plane on jacks, you can operate the landing gear and get used to the controls before taking the ship off the ground. From the general cockpit arrangement of the P-40, you can see that on the left are the landing gear and flap selector levers, the rudder and elevator trim controls, the engine control levers, and the fuel selector. The instrument board contains landing gear and flap indicator, fuselage fuel tank gauge, flight and engine instruments, and electric switches. On the right side of the cockpit are controls for carburetor heat, radio, cowl flaps, and auxiliary hydraulic pump. The pilot's seat and pedal adjustments are conventional.
The biggest fear perhaps in combat, you're coming back, your aircraft is maybe damaged. You may have collected a few unwelcome bullet holes. You need to know then, as you come down onto the landing strip, that your gear is down and secure. And an indicator of that will be, of course, this, because when the gear comes down, the red stick pops up. So you know your gear is down and locked. It could not perform above 15,000 feet as adequately as the Spitfires and the Mustangs later versus the Focke-Wulf 190 and the ME 109. So it withdrew from northwestern Europe. Be it over the hot burning deserts, or the frozen cold Russian steppes, or the jungles the P-40 saw combat throughout all the theatres in World War II. The Curtiss product, rugged, robust, highly manoeuvrable, was quite capable of dealing with anything thrown in its path, given its optimum combat performance conditions. From the Flying Tigers, who took the very early P-40Bs into combat, to the later P-40Ds and down to the P-40N. The RAF, of course, putting that classic shark's tooth on there that is forever resonant of the fierceness of the P-40. And by crikey, on the wrong end of that shark tooth, you knew the P-40 was fierce. And it would be fearsome and feared by many a German, Japanese or Italian pilot during the combat days of World War II.
The P-40 then wasn't the all-round fighter the Allies wished for, and may not always have had performance on its side. But one attribute it has always had is being utterly photogenic. Mike Killian is a world-famous aviation and spaceflight photographer, and when he fulfilled a client's brief to photograph their P-40 air-to-air, he bolted on a head-mounted camera to catch the results.
So when I am shooting air-to-air, I prefer to use a mid-range lens. A 24 to 105 millimeter lens is my workhorse. Normally the planes are pretty close, so I don't really need telephoto, and you don't want to use telephoto when you're flying anyway, because you're being thrown around, you're bouncing around. It's very rarely an actual smooth flight. So the more zoom you're looking through, the bouncier that frame is going to be and the more difficult the shot is. Having a mid-range lens is not very heavy, so the less weight I have to hold under G, the better. Race pilot Tom Richard, he's also a warbird instructor pilot and an airshow pilot who travels all over the country every year. And the P-40, named Jackie C-2, is based at the American Air Power Museum in New York. Sometimes he brings the plane down to Florida. One day he gave me a call and asked me if I'd be interested in flying a different kind of photo shoot with him, and about halfway to Homestead decided to do some formation loops. So it's one thing being nice and level and steady photographing air to air. It's another thing doing it upside down multiple times together and photographing under G. It can be a pretty stressful environment, but Tom trusted me to get it right. We've worked together a lot over the years, so we have very good understanding between the both of us when we're in the sky. So it really came down to we started the loop and everything looked good, but it wasn't exactly to my liking. I wanted to do it again, so I gave him a quick hand signal at the end, just a circular motion out the window, and he knew exactly what I meant. Communicated it to my pilot, Robert Pinkston, and once again we went up with another formation loop, and this time right on the money. These guys did a fantastic job. They put me exactly where I needed to be to get the shots, and you can see the result in the video. Jackie C is a fantastic P-40. It's shark mouth. It's that famous shark mouth on the nose is probably one of the most iconic fighters in all of aviation history, just for that reason. These planes are living history, so it's about more than just the photos. The photos tell a story, they document living history and get people excited. come out to the air shows and support these guys, support the museums who raise money privately to keep these planes flying, to keep living history alive, so that the next generation can learn about these things and be inspired to pursue aviation on their own, whether they want to just do it privately or they want to go in the military or whatever the case may be.